What happens when a city lives too close to the edge of history? When it rises with prophecy, burns with faith, thrives on trade, and then disappears beneath silence? The dust still clung to my boots when I arrived. The wind off the Orontes whispered of ancient fires. Beneath my feet lay the bones of a city once called the Crown of the East, a city older than empires, a city whose name once rivaled Rome, Antioch. Founded by the flight of an eagle, ruled by kings and emperors, it witnessed the birth of Christianity, the tremble of earthquakes, the clash of civilizations. Crusaders bled for it, sultans burned it, merchants crossed deserts to reach it, and yet today, few remember it even existed. What happened to the city where the word Christian was first spoken? Why did its walls fall without a final cry? How does a place so central, so powerful, become a ghost beneath a modern street? Over the next hour or so, we will walk the forgotten roads of Antioch, through the rise, the ruin, the riverbanks of trade, and the graveyards of war. We will uncover what remains beneath the silt and ask what this ancient city still has to teach us. Not just about the past, but about us. Pack your journal, light your torch. The expedition begins now. The sun was low when I first arrived at the banks of the Orontes. The light filtered through olive groves, and the river moved slow and amber, like it was guarding something. A hush lay over the valley, not silence, but the quiet of something ancient, watching. I climbed the slope above the river and let the wind guide me, carrying the scent of earth and stone and something faintly metallic. From that height, I saw it, the forgotten bones of a city buried beneath centuries of soil and memory. Antioch, a name that once rang across empires, now hidden in dust. It began, they say, with a bird. In the wake of Alexander the Great's death, his generals carved up his vast conquests. One of them, Seleucus Nicator, sought a capital. He stood on this very ground, not far from the river's bend, and released an eagle into the sky. The bird circled once, twice, then dropped a piece of sacrificial meat on the plain below. That was the sign. Where the eagle landed, Seleucus ordered the foundations of a city. That was over 23 centuries ago, in the 3rd century before Christ. The act was not just ritual, it was prophecy, divine sanction. The eagle, sacred to Zeus, marked this place for greatness, and so Antioch was born. But it was more than omen. This land was chosen with precision. To the west lay the Mediterranean, with its sea routes and coastal wealth. To the east, the caravan trails stretched deep into Persia and India. The Orontes River would feed the city's lifeblood, its waters used for drinking, for trade, and for defense. Seleucus named it after his father Antiochus, and he laid it out in the Hellenistic style, a grid of colonnaded streets, markets, fountains, temples to Greek gods. The city rose fast. Walls were built, gates fortified, towers crowned with braziers that could be seen from far across the plains. At night, Antioch must have shimmered like a lantern against the darkening wilderness. I walked those buried avenues, stones now moss-covered. But underfoot, I felt the rhythm of the old design. Here was the theater, there, the gymnasium. I imagined the echo of sandals against marble, the clang of smiths at their forges, the laughter of philosophers debating beneath painted porticos. It was a city made not only of stone, but of ambition. By the time the Seleucid Empire reached its height, Antioch had become more than a capital. It was a symbol, a city at the crossroads of continents, Greek in soul but Syrian in soil. Persian winds blew through its arches. Egyptian traders lined its markets. It was said you could walk the streets and hear 10 languages before reaching the next fountain. And yet, even at its beginning, shadows followed. Not far from the city walls, I found an old shrine, a ruin now, barely standing. The locals called it cursed. The stories spoke of the bones of older settlements buried beneath Antioch, forgotten villages swallowed by time. It reminded me that no city is truly born on clean earth. The past always waits beneath our feet. As twilight fell, I stood at the base of Mount Silpius. The citadel once stood here, overlooking all below. From its heights, rulers watched armies approach, storms gather, and stars rise. They believed their city would last forever. But history teaches in cycles. The eagle that marked this place has long vanished. Its wings turned to legend, yet the shadow it cast still lingers. It stretches across time from that first stone to the broken columns I now trace with my hand. And so begins our journey through Antioch, a city dreamed into being by omen, shaped by empire, and destined for both glory and ruin. In the eagle's shadow, we take our first step. Let the past guide us forward. The dust lifted gently as I stepped through what remained of Antioch's western gate. The stones beneath my feet were smooth, worn by centuries of passage, sandals, boots, hooves, and wheels. I paused there, in the filtered morning light, and tried to picture the city, not as ruin, but as it once was, alive with voices, with color, with power. Rome had arrived. In the 1st century BC, the legion swept east. Pompey the Great, stern-faced and sunburned from the campaign, took control of Syria. He entered Antioch not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. The city was not razed, it was spared. Because even Rome, with its hunger for control, understood the value of Antioch. It was a jewel too precious to shatter. I walked the remains of the Roman Forum, where once marble statues cast long shadows and civic debates echoed under open sky. Here, orders were issued in Latin, then repeated in Greek. The two tongues danced around each other, entwined in law, commerce, and empire. Antioch had been Greek, but now it became something more. It became Roman. The transformation was not sudden. It was layered, like plaster over stone. The city expanded. New aqueducts brought water down from the hills. Engineers raised arches, bridges, and roads that reached as far as the Euphrates. In the baths of Daphne, I still felt the warmth in the marble, as if the past had only just stepped out. It was there that senators bathed, poets composed, and generals whispered over maps. Antioch became one of the 4 great cities of the Roman Empire: Rome in the west, Alexandria to the south, Constantinople to the north, and here, Antioch, the gate to the east. Some called it the Rome of the Orient, others simply the city. Its population swelled to over 200,000. Merchants from India, Armenia, Egypt, and Arabia crowded the streets. Processions marched through arches. Children ran past olive vendors and mosaic workshops. In the colonnaded streets, light filtered through white stone. It reflected off polished statues. It fell across crimson robes and golden jewelry. Everything shone. And yet, with glory came decadence. Roman chroniclers wrote of excess, of masked festivals that drowned in wine, of theater productions that mocked the very emperors who funded them, of whispered plots and prophetic dreams in the temples. But even in its indulgence, Antioch was magnificent. Julius Caesar passed through here, so did Augustus. Later, during campaigns against Parthia, emperors used Antioch as a military base. Legions camped outside the walls, while generals consulted astrologers and strategists within. Even Nero, far away in Rome, felt the pull of Antioch's theater and madness. The city had a pulse, seductive and dangerous. Then came Titus, then Trajan, and Hadrian. Each left a mark, inscriptions in Latin carved into stone, coins minted with Antioch's name beside their own. The city was not just a waypoint, it was a statement, a declaration that Rome's light could reach even into the edges of the world, but all light casts shadows. I stood at the edge of what had once been the imperial palace. Nothing remained but broken tiles and the faint outline of walls. A stray dog passed behind me. The wind stirred the trees, and I felt it, the silence that comes after greatness. Not defeat, not yet, but the first stillness before the storm. Antioch, in the Roman era, was a mirror, reflecting both the splendor and fragility of empire. It rose high, adorned with marble and crowned with banners, but deep within its alleys and archives, I sensed the beginning of unraveling. The Romans came calling. They brought power, order, and stone, but in doing so, they also left a weight, one that would press down through the centuries until the city could no longer bear it. I turned from the ruins and looked eastward. The journey was far from over. The scent of damp stone and old ash lingered in the air as I stepped into the cave. It was quiet inside, not empty, but full of memory. This was no ordinary cavern. Cut into the base of Mount Silpius, this hollow space once rang with voices, hymns, prayers whispered in the shadows. They say this was the Church of St. Peter, one of the oldest in the world. Outside, the sun still burned on the ruined rooftops of Antioch, but here, in the flickering light of my lantern, I felt something deeper, a pulse beneath the rock, the echo of a faith forged in fire. Long before cathedrals, before councils and creeds, Christianity took root in places like this. Quiet places, dangerous places, and few were more important than Antioch. In the 1st century after Christ, the city was already a marvel, Greek in its foundation, Roman in its order, and yet uniquely its own. It had become a meeting point for peoples and tongues. Jewish synagogues stood near pagan temples. Stoic philosophers debated beside spice merchants. And in the midst of it all, something new was stirring. According to ancient texts, it was here that the followers of Jesus were first called Christians, not in Jerusalem, not in Rome, but in Antioch. It was a name born not from celebration, but mockery, a label given by outsiders who watched these strange followers love their enemies and speak of a crucified Messiah. I imagined them walking these streets, not in robes of glory, but in worn sandals, fearful yet unyielding. They met in homes, in markets, and yes, in caves like this one. They shared bread, sang quietly, and remembered a teacher who had walked among fishermen and tax collectors. A man they believed had conquered death. The city itself became a crucible. After the scattering of believers following persecution in Jerusalem, many fled here. Antioch became a center of Christian thought, worship, and leadership. Paul and Barnabas taught here. Peter, they say, preached from this very cave. The first bishops rose from these gatherings, their names carved into the history of the early church. But faith, in Antioch was never without conflict. Roman officials viewed this growing sect with suspicion, too strange, too subversive. Temples to Jupiter and Apollo still drew crowds, and imperial cults demanded loyalty. To follow Christ was to risk ridicule, even death. More than once the fires came. Under emperors like Dacius and Diocletian, Christians were hunted. They were dragged from their homes, forced to recant. Some refused, some died. Others fled to the hills. But the movement never stopped. In fact, it grew. I placed my hand on the stone altar within the cave. It was rough, scarred by time, but I could still make out the shape of a cross, faintly etched by a believer long gone. Not ornate, not majestic, just honest. The mark of someone who believed enough to carve it into the bones of the earth. By the 4th century, everything changed. Constantine embraced Christianity. Churches rose where once there had been hiding places. Antioch became not just a sanctuary, but a seat of power. The great church was built vast, gilded, resplendent. The city hosted councils. Doctrine was debated, defined, and defended. But with acceptance came argument. Heresies flared, leaders clashed. The faith that had once unified the broken began to fracture under the weight of empire. Still, the roots held. As I stepped back into the light, I looked once more at the city below. Modern, scarred, but still standing. Somewhere in those streets, prayers still rise, candles still burn, and the name Christian, first spoken here in uncertainty and defiance, still echoes. In Antioch, faith was not a monument, it was a flame, lit in darkness, fed by courage, and kept alive by those who believed it was worth everything to carry it forward. The ground felt different here. I had walked for hours through broken columns and crumbling arches, past worn mosaics and sunken thresholds. But here, near the old southern gate of Antioch, the earth whispered of something else, something violent. The stones were not simply aged, they were shattered. Beneath my boots, I could feel the memory of impact. Antioch, for all its splendor, has always lived on the edge of catastrophe. Built atop fault lines, it was a city that rose in defiance of the earth itself. A gamble, a dream carved into shifting ground. The first great quake we know of struck in the year 188 before Christ. According to ancient records, the shaking lasted long enough to bring down temples and towers. Walls cracked open, statues toppled, fires spread in the chaos. Thousands were killed, but the city rebuilt. Always it rebuilt. That was the pattern. Collapse, then renewal. Grief, then determination. I stood by what had once been the Roman bathhouse. The marble floor was split like a puzzle. Water from a nearby spring now filled the cracks. In the quiet, I imagined the terror of that moment. The roar from beneath, the sudden darkness, the scream of stone giving way. No enemy, no warning, just the earth itself rising in fury. In the year 526, the worst came. A quake so devastating it is said to have killed more than 250,000 people. The numbers stagger the mind. The city was packed, thriving, layered with palaces and churches. Then, in an instant, it became a grave. Eyewitnesses described the sky turning black with dust. Whole districts vanished into the ground. Survivors ran through fire and rubble, calling out names lost in the smoke. The great church collapsed. Bishops were crushed in prayer. Fires, ignited by fallen lamps and cooking pots, swept through the ruins. I found fragments of frescoes still clinging to a half-standing wall, figures of saints, their eyes faded, their halos cracked. It was haunting, a reminder that even the sacred was not spared. The emperor at the time, Justinian, tried to help. He sent aid, rebuilt roads, funded churches, but the city never fully recovered. Each time it rose, it did so with more scars, more ghosts beneath its streets. By the 6th century, Antioch had suffered at least a dozen major earthquakes, and those are just the ones we know. The ground here does not rest. It murmurs, it shifts, it remembers. Even in modern times, the tremors continue. In recent years, devastating quakes have struck the region again. Whole neighborhoods of Antakya, the modern city built over ancient Antioch, have been reduced to rubble. Survivors dig through dust and ash, just as they did centuries ago. It is humbling to know that the forces which shaped and shattered Antioch are still with us, not lost to time, not trapped in stone, but alive, beneath our feet. I sat on a fallen capital half buried in the earth. Around me, the silence was heavy, not peaceful, not comforting, but dense, the kind of silence that follows after a scream. In Antioch, history is not just read, it is felt, through the breaks in pavement, through the misaligned pillars, through the stories of survivors, both ancient and modern, who carried their city on their backs. Civilizations build, nature breaks. We rebuild. That rhythm, that fragile defiance, is etched into the very soul of this place. Antioch did not fall only to war or time. It bowed, again and again, to the shaking of the earth, and yet it endured, not untouched, not unbroken, but still here, still whispering through the dust. Twilight came slowly across the plain. The wind from the mountains carried a chill, and the Orontes flowed like ink beneath a sky turning violet. I stood on a ridge outside the city, just high enough to see the ruins of walls and the shattered dome of a forgotten church. In that fading light, it was easy to imagine banners on the horizon, gold and crimson, green and silver, the colors of empires colliding. This was no backwater. Antioch was a prize, a key, a door between worlds. And in the centuries after Rome, that door would be tested again and again. After the division of the Roman Empire, Antioch fell under the eastern rule of Byzantium. Greek replaced Latin in the halls of government. The cross flew higher than the eagle. But while the emperors in Constantinople claimed authority, their grip on the eastern frontier was always fragile. To the east, the Sassanian Empire watched. It was ancient, Persian, proud. Its kings styled themselves as heirs to Darius and Cyrus, and they had not forgotten Antioch. I walked the old road where traders once moved between empires. You could feel it in the ground, the weight of centuries of footsteps. Caravans, diplomats, soldiers. Some came with silk and myrrh, others with fire and steel. In the year 613, that fire arrived. The Sassanian general Sharbaraz, brilliant and relentless, led his armies westward. The Byzantines had grown weak, distracted by internal quarrels, burdened by plague and debt. Antioch's defenders were few, its walls aging. The siege was swift. The city fell. What followed was not mercy. The Persians sacked Antioch. Churches were burned, relics taken. Thousands deported across the mountains into Persian lands. The great church, once a symbol of Christian glory, was desecrated. I could still see soot marks on the surviving stone. The scars of fire do not fade easily. And yet, for the Sassanians, this was not just conquest. It was a message that they too could rule where Rome had ruled, that their civilization, older and deeper than the West admitted, could reclaim its space on the world's stage. But empires are restless things. Just over a decade later, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius struck back. His campaign was bold, almost suicidal, but it worked. The Persians were driven out. Antioch was reclaimed. I imagine the rejoicing in the streets, the bells, the banners, the return of priests and soldiers. But even in victory, something had shifted. The city was weaker. The population had dwindled. The grandeur of Roman Antioch had flickered. Now it was something else, a survivor. And the shadows were not finished. I sat beside the broken base of a statue, likely once of an emperor or saint. Around me, the silence grew, but it was not peace. It was the breath before another storm. In less than 2 decades, a new power would rise from the deserts of Arabia, and Antioch, scarred by Byzantines and Persians alike, would face yet another transformation. But in this chapter, this brief moment between empires, the city was a mirror, a reflection of 2 civilizations, the Christian West and the Zoroastrian East, each with its visions, its myths, its weapons. Antioch stood at the center of it all, not as a ruler, but as a witness, a city caught between titans, a crossroads where faith, fire, and ambition met. And as I watched the last light disappear behind Mount Silpius, I felt it, the stillness of a place that had seen too much, and knew it was not yet over. Dawn came slow over the river. A thin mist curled above the Orontes, and the fields beyond the walls were quiet, too quiet for a city that once echoed with the clamor of trade and the thunder of hooves. I crossed the old bridge at first light. The stones beneath me, still damp from the night, bore no inscription, but they remembered. This was the bridge the Arab armies crossed in the year 637. Led by the general Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Rashidun forces approached Antioch like a tide long held back. It was not the first time the city had changed hands, but this time, everything would change. I stood where the iron gate once stood tall. The walls were thick then. Byzantine soldiers manned the towers. Yet there was no great battle, no siege that burned for weeks. The city had been weakened by war with Persia, by plagues, by political rot, and when the Muslim forces came, Antioch yielded, not from cowardice, but from exhaustion. The Crescent rose where the cross had flown. Arabic voices filled the streets where Greek and Latin once ruled. But this was no mindless destruction. This was transformation. The Caliphate, centered in Medina, was young, but it moved with vision. Instead of tearing Antioch apart, they preserved what worked. Christian communities were allowed to remain. Churches stood, though taxes were levied. Trade resumed. New languages and customs entered the markets. I wandered through what remained of the old souk. The covered bazaar had long since fallen, but the outlines were there. Stalls, courtyards, water basins once used for prayer and cleansing. The air was different now, carrying stories in Arabic, in Armenian, in Syriac. Antioch had become part of something new, a growing Islamic world that stretched from the Arabian desert to the edge of Persia. It was no longer a Roman city, no longer Byzantine. It was Syrian, Muslim, diverse. But even in change, the past lingered. The Christians who remained whispered prayers in hidden chapels. Some converted, others endured. The balance was fragile, but it held for a time. I walked to the top of the hill where once the patriarch's palace stood. Gone now. Only fragments of wall and broken tiles. From there, I could see the shape of the land, the way Antioch pressed against the mountains, cradled by rivers and ridges. It made sense why so many had fought for it. why it never vanished. In the 8th and 9th centuries, under the Umayyads and later the Abbasids, the city remained a vital link. Not as grand as it once was, but still important, still beating. Art changed, architecture shifted, arches became pointed. Calligraphy replaced statues. The mosaics faded, but the city did not fall. And yet, beneath the peace, tensions brewed. I met a local historian who showed me fragments of pottery, glazed with blue patterns, geometric and strange, Islamic designs layered over Hellenistic foundations, pieces of a puzzle that never quite fit, but somehow held together. Antioch in this period was not a city of one culture. It was a blend, a contradiction, a place where the Quran was read in the shadow of old Roman columns, where minarets rose beside abandoned basilicas, where time bent. As I left the city that day, the call to prayer rose behind me, clear, steady, familiar, a sound that had echoed through Antioch's valleys for over 1,000 years. The Crescent did not erase the past, it wrote a new chapter beside it, a chapter of resilience, of adaptation, of empires rising and falling, and the city remaining, always shifting, always enduring, always Antioch. The morning sun broke across the rooftops like molten gold, spilling into the narrow lanes where once the lifeblood of Antioch pulsed. I followed it, tracing the forgotten arteries of a city that had once stood at the heart of the ancient world's commerce. The air still carried a hint of distant spice, a scent buried in the stones, lingering like memory. I wandered through the remains of the old bazaar district, broken arches, doorways half sunk in the ground, courtyards choked with weeds. And yet, as I stepped over a collapsed lintel, I could hear it, the ghost of voices calling out weights and prices, the rustle of silk against a merchant's hands, the soft jingle of coin against copper scale. For centuries, Antioch was not just a city, it was a crossroads, a gateway between the East and the West, between empires, between oceans and deserts. The Silk Road, that fabled artery of global trade, passed not far from here. Caravans from China and Central Asia brought bolts of silk, bricks of tea, jade, paper, and knowledge to Antioch's gates. From the ports along the Mediterranean came Roman wine, African ivory, Greek glass, and the words of philosophers. From the south, Arab traders carried incense, spices, pearls, and the deep songs of desert kingdoms. Antioch received it all. The Orontes River, winding and slow, was more than water. It was a mirror, a current of commerce. I stood by its edge and imagined the flat-bottomed boats gliding past, their hulls packed with dates and cloth, their sails stretched to catch the warm wind. The river brought life and stories. In Antioch's heyday, the markets never slept. Persian rugs rolled out beside Egyptian papyrus. Indian pepper changed hands beside Syrian olive oil. Silk was weighed with solemn care. Gold was bitten to test its purity, and always the sound of voices, Armenian, Greek, Arabic, Latin, Hebrew, Syriac, layered over each other like song. And then there were the inns. Caravanserais built of thick stone with high walls and wide courtyards, safe places for merchants to rest, share news, and exchange currencies. I stood in the ruins of one such inn, a square of broken columns and wind-swept dust. I closed my eyes and heard the laughter, the arguments, the deals struck by firelight. But trade was never just about goods, it was about ideas. It was here that Greek medicine met Indian astronomy, that Roman engineering mingled with Persian philosophy, that faiths crossed paths and sometimes clashed. I found a small pendant once buried beneath collapsed tiles, a coin from China pierced and worn, strung on a silk thread. It had made a journey of thousands of miles and somehow ended here in Antioch. That was the magic of this city. It gathered the world. But all currents shift. By the 13th century, the trade routes moved. New ports rose along the Black Sea. The Mongol invasions disrupted eastern supply lines. The riches that once flowed through Antioch began to thin. The river, once busy with cargo, grew quiet. The markets shrank. The bazaars dimmed. Still, the legacy remained. As I watched the sunset over the hills, I realized something. This city had once made the world smaller, had drawn it together, fold by fold, like fabric in a merchant's hand. Silk, spices, salt, stories. Antioch was more than stone. It was a passage, a meeting point, a memory of a time when the world, no matter how vast, could be held in the palm of a city, and some part of it still can. The wind pulled at my cloak as I climbed the outer ramparts, their stones scarred and sun-bleached, rising like ribs from the earth. Antioch's western wall still stood in places, jagged and defiant, its towers broken but proud. I ran my hand across the ancient mortar, where moss had taken root in the cracks, and felt the weight of a siege that once brought the world to its knees. It was the year 1097. The First Crusade was underway. Thousands of men from the Latin West had taken up the cross, called by faith, ambition, or desperation. Their destination was Jerusalem. But before they could reach it, they had to pass through here, Antioch, the key to the Levant. I stood where the road from Anatolia met the river valley. In the distance, I imagined the dust clouds rising not from caravans, but from armies, knights in chainmail, archers from Normandy, foot soldiers from Flanders. They came hungry, ill-prepared, driven by prophecy and flame, and before them loomed the walls of Antioch, strong, steep, and held by the Seljuk Turks. The siege lasted more than 8 months. It was not glory, it was starvation. The Crusaders built siege engines from scrap wood, dug trenches, and waited. Disease spread in the camps, horses were eaten, some deserted, others dreamed of miracles. Inside the city, the garrison held firm. Supplies were tight, morale flickered. But the walls did their job. Antioch had survived empires. Now it faced a new kind of storm. Not from the east, but from the Christian west. Then came the betrayal. A tower guard, a convert to the Crusaders' cause, opened a gate in the dead of night. The Western forces poured in, swords drawn, banners raised. The city fell, not with a roar, but with a cry. I walked those narrow lanes where blood once ran between stones. Churches were reclaimed, mosques were sacked, the defenders were slaughtered. It was said the streets were filled with the dead, a grim offering to a cause believed righteous. But the siege was not over. A new army, led by the Muslim general Kurboga, soon arrived. The Crusaders, now inside the city, became the besieged. Hunger returned. Despair set in. And then, a relic was found. A lance, claimed to be the holy lance that pierced Christ on the cross. Whether true or not, it ignited belief. Strength returned. And in a daring assault, the Crusaders defeated Kurboga's army and held the city. Antioch was theirs. But not for Jerusalem. Not yet. The leaders stayed. They argued. They claimed Antioch for themselves. A new principality was declared. A western foothold in an eastern land. I sat in the ruins of the old citadel, Crusader stone layered atop Roman foundation. I imagined the banners flapping in the wind, lions, crosses, fleur-de-lis. Men from foreign lands ruling over a city they barely understood. And yet, they remained. For nearly 2 centuries, Antioch became a Crusader stronghold. Churches were rebuilt, Latin clergy installed. The city changed again, a crossroads now ringed with swords. But nothing in this region is permanent. I walked down to the gate known as St. Paul's Gate. Its arch still stands. Beneath it, traders once passed, some with fear, others with hope. Behind those walls, power shifted, faith collided, and the city endured it all. The Crusaders came not just with weapons, but with walls, fortifications, borders. They reshaped Antioch into something new and something fragile. For walls may hold back armies, but they cannot hold back time. And in Antioch, even stone must eventually fall. The air was dry at sunrise. I walked alone through the remnants of Antioch's northern quarter, where once banners had flown high above stone towers. The silence here felt heavier than usual, like the city itself remembered. In these broken walls, you could still sense the ambitions of those who came not just to conquer, but to rule. After the First Crusade, Antioch did not return to the east. It did not march with the others to Jerusalem. It became something else entirely, a kingdom in miniature, a principality on foreign soil, a frontier experiment in faith, power, and survival. Bohemond of Taranto, one of the Crusade's boldest leaders, claimed Antioch for himself, not as a servant of the church, not as a mere pilgrim, but as a prince, and for nearly 2 centuries his successors would try to hold it. They called it the Principality of Antioch. It was a place of strange alliances. Frankish lords ruled over Arab, Armenian, Greek, and Syriac subjects. Latin bishops oversaw churches where the liturgy had once been sung in ancient tongues. Crusader castles rose on hills already sacred to others. The city became a patchwork of authority, a balance always at risk of tipping. I stood in the shadow of a crumpled bell tower half buried in wild grass. This had once been the Latin Cathedral of St. Peter, built atop the older church, which in turn stood on the cave where Peter had first preached. Layer upon layer, each generation building upon the bones of the last, but none of it was ever secure. The Principality was always surrounded. To the north, the Byzantine Empire watched with suspicion. To the south, Muslim dynasties prepared for retribution. To the east, Armenian princes both traded with and resisted the Franks. Every alliance was a gamble, every treaty a question of time. I found remnants of old correspondence in the museum archives, letters between the princes of Antioch and the kings of Jerusalem. Desperate requests for aid, warnings of betrayal, plans for marriage alliances to strengthen thin claims. Inside these words, you could feel the tension, the fear. Even within the walls, not all was unified. Nobles bickered, power shifted, and as generations passed, the Franks who ruled Antioch became something in between. Not fully Western, not fully Eastern. Their customs adapted, their accents changed. They married local women, raised children who spoke multiple languages, and prayed in multiple tongues. And still, the walls held. I climbed to one of the outlying towers, its base cracked but still overlooking the valley below. From here, the princes of Antioch would have watched the roads, ever alert for the dust trail of an approaching army. And one day, it came. In the year 1268, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars led his forces north, a master of siegecraft, ruthless and patient. The Crusader states were weak by then, divided, isolated. Antioch stood no chance. The city fell, burned, broken. Thousands were killed, thousands more enslaved. The Principality ended not with ceremony, but with silence. I sat near the shattered remains of the cathedral's gate. Time had softened the edges, but the wound remained. The Principality of Antioch was a dream carved into a place that never truly welcomed it, a fragile kingdom floating between faith and force. For a time it held, and then, like all things built on borrowed stone, it crumbled. Yet even in failure, its story endures, a reminder that in Antioch, nothing stays forever. Not empires, not faiths, not kings, only the earth and the echoes of what once was. The sea breeze reached me long before I saw the shore. Soft and salt-laced, it whispered of journeys no longer taken. I stood at the edge of the old port road, staring out over the plains where merchants once queued with their wares, now empty, quiet, forgotten. The wind carried a different scent now, not of spice or silk, but of absence. Here, Antioch began to fade. The decline was not sudden. No single catastrophe swept it away. Instead, it was a slow turning, a shift in the winds. The ancient arteries of commerce, once flowing through this valley like rivers of gold, began to dry. For centuries, Antioch had thrived as a commercial hub. It sat like a jewel at the convergence of roads, from the east, from the coast, from the mountains. Caravans arrived with goods from Persia, India, and beyond. The Orontes River gave passage to the Mediterranean. But by the 13th century, those paths had changed. The Mongol invasions to the east fractured trade across Asia. Routes were redirected north toward the Black Sea, bypassing Antioch entirely. New ports in Cilicia and further west drew the ships that once docked here. Even the Silk Road shifted its weight. Antioch, once central, became peripheral. I walked through the remains of an old customs house. Its walls still bore faded frescoes of ships and birds and vines. Dust covered the stone floor where merchants once laid out scales and parchment. The silence was complete. A building designed to measure value, now emptied of it. This city had always survived by motion goods in, goods out, people moving. But the movement slowed. In the markets, fewer stalls remained open. The sounds of trade dulled. The coin lost its clink. I imagined a silk merchant packing his final chest, looking west with a furrowed brow. Not because war had come, but because buyers had gone. The Mamluks, after taking Antioch in 1268, focused their power elsewhere. Cairo rose. Damascus thrived. Antioch became a provincial outpost. Important, yes, but not essential. A city that once sat at the table of kings was now dismissed to the edge of the map. The infrastructure decayed. Roads crumbled. The river, silted and shallow, could no longer carry the traffic it once did. I stood by a collapsed quay where goods were once loaded by hand, piece by precious piece. Now, only reeds moved in the water. And yet, the people remained. Fishermen still cast nets into the shallows. Farmers brought produce to dwindling markets. Priests and imams still led prayers. Children still ran through alleys, oblivious to the empire that had once danced through these streets. But the grandeur had dimmed, the mosaics cracked, the villas decayed, and as century turned to century, Antioch became not a center, but a memory, a name on old charts, a chapter in forgotten books. I sat on the worn steps of an old warehouse, watching the wind move through dry grass. It struck me then that cities do not die all at once. They unravel, piece by piece, dream by dream. Trade built Antioch, carried it to glory, sustained it through fire and flood. But trade is fickle. It flows like water, always seeking the lowest, easiest path. And when it finds a new way, the old becomes still. The winds had changed, and Antioch, once the pulse of empires, stood quietly in their wake, watching, waiting, fading. Smoke still lingers in the soil here. I could smell it, faint and bitter, as I stepped through the scorched remains of what had once been a chapel. The roof had long since collapsed, and the altar was broken, its marble face blackened by flame. I picked up a shard of pottery from the ash-covered floor and held it in the light. The glaze had melted, a quiet testimony to the heat that had consumed this place. This was not time's decay. This was something more violent. The year was 1268. Antioch was a city on edge, a Crusader stronghold still standing while other principalities had crumbled around it, a fragile remnant of the Latin West clinging to the eastern frontier. The city had been proud once, defiant, but its defenses had grown thin, its allies had grown distant, and its enemies were growing bold. From the south came Sultan Baybars, Mamluk commander, strategist, relentless. He had already taken Caesarea, then Arsuf, then Safad. His march north was precise, not a raid, but a reckoning. I walked the southern road, the same path the Mamluk army would have taken. Dust still gathered between the stones. I imagined the thunder of hooves, the flutter of green banners, the silence of citizens watching from behind shuttered windows. They must have known. Baybars arrived in May. The siege began without delay. Antioch's walls, so tall and strong in centuries past, could not hold against his engines. Siege towers creaked forward. Catapults launched fire. The gates, undermined and battered, began to fail. Within the city, panic spread. There would be no reinforcements, no escape. Then, the breach. The Mamluks poured in. What followed was not conquest, it was devastation. Eyewitness accounts speak of the slaughter. Thousands killed, churches torn open, homes burned. The patriarch's quarters were stormed, the citadel fell, and in the narrow lanes where children once played, I walked those streets. Narrow, twisting, lined with the shattered remains of columns and beams. Fire had climbed the walls, leapt from roof to roof. Some buildings had simply collapsed under the heat. Others stood hollowed out like blackened bones. The bodies were long gone, but the silence remained. It is said that Baybars took nearly all the survivors as captives. Men, women, children marched away from the ruins of their city. Some were ransomed, many were not. The Principality of Antioch, that strange, stubborn remnant of Crusader ambition, was gone. Not taken, erased. I found a stone cross buried beneath rubble. The arms were broken, the edges scorched. I held it for a moment, brushing off soot that had become part of the stone itself. Faith had not protected this place, nor had politics, nor pride. Baybars left behind no governor, no occupying force, just ruins. A warning, Antioch was no longer a threat, no longer a prize. It had been made an example. As I climbed the hill above the city, I looked back at what remained, pockets of structure, foundations visible beneath fields of wild grass, the shape of a street, the curve of an arch. Smoke no longer rose here, but the memory of flame was everywhere. History often remembers the rise, the glory, the moments of triumph, but it is here, in the ash, that you feel the truth. Antioch fell not with a whisper, but with a scream, and it has never truly risen again. The river moved slowly today, thick and silent as it wound its way past the modern edge of Antakya. I followed it until the banks grew soft underfoot. Mud and moss clung to my boots, and with each step I sank deeper into a land that had swallowed its own story. Antioch did not simply burn and vanish, it was buried. Over the centuries, the Orontes flooded its banks again and again. Storms came. Earthquakes cracked the city's bones. Then the Silt arrived, carried by the water, laid down like a shroud. It was not conquest that sealed Antioch's final fate. It was time and the slow, patient hand of the earth. I knelt beside a trench opened during an old excavation. Even now, after so many years, shards of tile still glimmered beneath the soil. Red, green, and gold, faint remnants of floors that once echoed with footsteps. This was no ordinary mud. This was memory, compressed into silence. In the early 20th century, a team of archaeologists, led by Princeton University and the French government, came to uncover what remained. Between 1932 and 1939, they dug beneath homes, fields, and riverbanks. What they found stunned even the most seasoned scholars. Over 300 mosaics emerged from the deep, scenes of gods and feasts, of birds in flight, of warriors and nymphs and poets. The colors still vivid, the lines still graceful. It was as if the city had only just closed its eyes. I visited the Hate Archaeology Museum, where many of these mosaics now rest. Room after room of stone floors lifted from the dark. One image stood out, a reclining skeleton, a smile on its face, holding a goblet. Beneath it, in Greek, the words, "Be cheerful, enjoy your life," a message from the dead. Or perhaps, a warning from those who knew how quickly joy could vanish. But it was not only art that surfaced. Walls, columns, tools, coins from across the empire. In one ruined home, they found a child's toy. In another, a fresco half-finished, brushstrokes frozen in time. Each layer of silt uncovered told a different version of Antioch, the Roman port, the Byzantine capital, the Crusader fortress, all buried together. And yet much remains untouched. Most of ancient Antioch still sleeps beneath modern Antakya. Streets that once bustled are now trapped under foundations. Aqueducts run beneath parking lots. The old hippodrome lies beneath a cemetery. Excavation is difficult and dangerous. Lives are built on top of history here. And so, the city waits. Sometimes, after heavy rain, pieces emerge. A fragment of mosaic in a farmer's field. A carved stone unearthed by a construction crew. The earth gives back slowly and not always willingly. As I stood on a rise above the city, the Orontes glinted in the distance. Calm, deceptive. It had buried Antioch, but also preserved it, protected it in layers of silt and shadow. A secret kept, waiting for the right hands to uncover it. What strikes me most is this: how easily memory can be hidden, not destroyed, not erased, just covered. Antioch lives on, not only in books or museums, but in the ground beneath our feet. A city beneath a city, a voice beneath the noise. And if we are careful, if we listen closely, we might still hear it. I stepped into Antakya beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver. The streets were narrow, lined with tangled wires and low rooftops, some crumbling, some freshly painted. Children laughed in alleys where emperors once rode. The call to prayer rose from a distant minaret. A bus rumbled past, and somewhere beneath it all, Antioch slept. Modern Antakya is a living city. Markets buzz, car horns echo, laundry hangs from windows, and sunlight bounces off plastic signs. But if you look closely, if you listen between the sounds, you can feel something deeper. This is not just a city of the present, it is a shadow of something far older. Antakya rests directly atop ancient Antioch. Beneath the asphalt are the colonnaded streets. Beneath apartment blocks, the mosaic floors of Roman villas still lie in silence. Time did not move away from this place. It simply layered itself over it. I followed a winding street that led up toward Mount Silpius. Here, the slope rises above the city, and at its base lies the cave church of St. Peter. Cut into the rock face, this hollow is dark and cool, its air thick with centuries of breath and candle smoke. Pilgrims still come here. Some kneel, some cry, all listen. This cave is not marked by grandeur. Its walls are rough, the altar is simple, and yet it might be the oldest place of Christian worship in the world. Not rebuilt, not repainted, just held in place, quietly defying the years. Back in the city center, I wandered through the Hete Archaeology Museum. It holds more Roman mosaics than anywhere else on Earth, whole floors lifted from their original homes, each one a frozen moment of ancient life. Hunters, lovers, feasts, myths, and death. But outside the museum, time feels heavier. The city has suffered. Earthquakes have scarred its walls again and again. Most recently, in the year 2023, a powerful quake struck the region. Homes collapsed. Lives were lost. Many of the old buildings, already fragile, were reduced to rubble. The past, both ancient and recent, was shaken loose again. I stood at a street corner where two eras met. On one side, a coffee vendor beneath a faded awning. On the other, a Roman column embedded in the wall of a bakery. Neither seemed out of place. That is the truth of Antakya. The ancient and the modern do not live beside each other. They are one and the same. The people here carry stories in their bones. Greek, Arab, Armenian, Turkish, Jewish, Assyrian, Muslim, and Christian, living in the long echo of something vast and unfinished. I sat with an old man in a tea house. He pointed to a cracked mosaic near the door and said softly, "That was found under my father's house." He didn't speak of it with pride, just familiarity, as if history were not a treasure but a neighbor. In Antakya, the past is not behind you. It is beneath you, within you. And though Antioch may be buried, its ghost still walks these streets. You feel it in the names, in the stones, in the way light falls across the river at dusk. This is not just a city built on ruins. It is a city made of them. And somewhere in its breath, the ancient world still speaks. Not loudly, not clearly, but if you walk slowly, if you stand still enough, you might hear it. Just an echo, but enough. The dust rose as I walked along the riverbank. Not much moved. The Orontes flowed slow and brown beneath a pale afternoon sun. Its waters had carried the weight of empires, the ashes of cities, the bones of those who called Antioch home. Now it drifted quietly, a mirror for the sky and a keeper of secrets. I sat by the water's edge and watched leaves float by. All around me were fragments, not just of stone or tile, but of memory. Bits of carved marble, shards of pottery, outlines of streets long erased. You could almost feel the city breathing beneath the soil. Not dead, just sleeping. Antioch teaches slowly. It does not shout its wisdom, it whispers. This was a city built by ambition, chosen by an eagle, carved into a crossroads. For centuries it flourished. A meeting place of cultures, a marketplace of belief, a jewel in the crowns of kings and conquerors. But nothing here lasted, not the gods, not the rulers. And that is the first lesson. Power is never permanent. Seleucids, Romans, Byzantines, Crusaders, Mamluks, all claimed Antioch, all raised their banners, all built, ruled, and believed they would endure. But they were wrong. The stones remain. Their names only echoes. Even the greatest empires crumble. Even the tallest towers fall. I traced my hand across a broken column near the old forum. Once, this would have been part of a temple. Now, it was a resting place for crows and creeping vines. The people who walked here believed they were the center of the world, just as we do now. The second lesson is humility. Antioch did not fall all at once. It faded, slowly. Trade routes shifted. Rivers changed course. Earthquakes came. Politics fractured. And in those cracks, the city began to slip. Not with fire at first, but with silence. Markets grew quiet. Streets emptied. One season at a time. It reminds us that collapse is often quiet. We look for disasters, for final blows. But most of the time, the end comes like dusk. Gradual, gentle, unnoticed until the stars appear. And still, people endured. That may be the most important lesson of all. Through fire and siege, through flood and famine, through conquest and loss, people stayed. They rebuilt, they prayed, they loved. Even now, in modern Antakya, the spirit of the old city remains. Not in marble columns or grand churches, but in laughter, in stories, in the simple act of surviving. Antioch is not just a city of ruins, it is a city of resilience. As I stood to leave, I turned once more toward the hills. The light was fading, shadows stretched across the fields, and I thought of all the lives lived here, the triumphs, the betrayals, the hopes. What does a city remember? What does it forget? The dust carries both. And so we walk through it, careful, listening, learning. History is not a straight road. It bends, it disappears, it surprises. Antioch teaches us to question, to pause, to understand that no culture, no power, no truth is immune to time. But also that beauty endures, that stories survive, that even in broken stone, something sacred remains. And if we are wise, we will keep listening, because in the dust of Antioch, the past does not disappear. I stood in the half-light of an ancient bathhouse. My torch flickered along damp stone walls, tracing the curve of forgotten archways. Water dripped slowly from the ceiling. Each drop echoed like a heartbeat in the silence. Dust clung to every surface, as if time itself had settled into rest. This was not the grandeur of temples or the sweep of colonnades. It was something more intimate, a quiet place where lives once unfolded. Steam once filled the air here. Voices laughed, secrets were shared, and now, nothing, or so it seems. Antioch is not gone. Not really. It lives in the stones, in the soil, in the stories passed down, and the questions left unanswered. And as I stood there, alone, I made a promise to return, not just with shovel and brush, but with presence, with curiosity, with respect. This city was never meant to be forgotten. It stood for over 1,000 years as a beacon of culture, trade, and belief. It saw the rise and fall of empires, It held the hopes of generations. And now, though it sleeps beneath silt and stone, it waits for us, the explorers of the present, to remember it. I walked back through the alleys of modern Antakya. Children played soccer between the foundations of Roman villas. A woman passed carrying groceries down a street once lined with statues. Life goes on. It always does. And yet, something lingers. You can feel it in the wind that slips down from Mount Silpius, in the curve of an arch reused in a garden wall, in the mosaic tile repurposed as a doorstep. The past is not buried, it is woven into the fabric of now. And it calls, not for nostalgia, but for recognition, for those who choose to listen, to seek, to question. We are not tourists here. We are part of a larger journey, one that began with an eagle circling the sky and continues every time we take a step toward the forgotten. I do not know what I will find when I return. Perhaps another mosaic, perhaps a broken amphora, perhaps nothing but silence. But that is the explorer's path, not the certainty of answers, but the beauty of pursuit. Antioch reminds us that history is not a line, it is a spiral. We come back to the same places, the same questions, again and again, each time with new eyes. And now, it is your journey too. You, listening in the quiet, are part of this story. You carry it forward. You hold the torch. Because somewhere, in some dusty corridor, waits the next discovery, the next whisper from the past, the next moment when the veil lifts and the world long gone becomes, for a breath, alive again. That is the promise, to return, to remember, to keep searching, because history does not end. It folds into itself. It lingers in ruins and in rivers. It hides in shadows and surfaces in dreams. And if you walk with patience, if you tread gently on the bones of old cities, you will hear it. The voice of Antioch, faint but clear, not an echo, but a welcome. And that, dear explorer, is where the journey begins again.